This is lecture number 6 in the ABCs of Communism. We're going to focus in this lecture on the development of the Soviet economy in the 1920s, especially from 1924 to 1928, which are the critical years. And before I do that, I want to mention that in the textbook, we're taking a big jump here. We're skipping over the entire decision to intervene in China, which has an entire chapter, chapter 14, called Bolshevism Spreads to China. I'll just mention some highlights of what had occurred before 1924. Now, the situation in 1922 for the Bolsheviks was one in which they would like to be recognized by the capitalist countries in the West, and they'd like to engage in trade. But they're under a blockade. All of those capitalist countries have agreed to not to trade with the Soviet Union, except under certain very harsh conditions. But a trade agreement is, a conference is set for Genoa, Italy, in April of 1922, and the Soviets are invited. Right now, all of the developments of Western technology are being denied to them. So, being sent to this conference in Genoa is a delegation headed by some of the men who joined in July of 1917 at the same time Trotsky did, who for various reasons had not been willing to do that beforehand, but which were now willing to do it. Nor had the Bolsheviks really wanted them. Guys like Christian Lurakovsky were noblemen. They came from aristocratic families, and they had that kind of education and background and that kind of wealthy opportunity as youth. They didn't fit in with the Bolsheviks in any way. So the Bolsheviks really didn't need them. They didn't have anything for them to do. They couldn't have them robbing banks. That's not what these guys are used to. So there was one man that could rob banks and go to bourgeois balls at the same time, Leonid Krassin, but that was a rare sort of person. At any rate, this time he's got Christian Rakovsky and Chicherin, and they're already conferring with top Wehrmacht and German government leaders in 1922 about a trade agreement between Germany and the Soviet Republic. If it comes to that, the Germans are ready to go it alone. Now, this is something that the Allies don't know, the Allies being Britain and France. What they want to do is to get as much money out of the Russians as they can and try to restore capitalism in Russia by their demands. Well, Rakovsky says in documents that we have, and you can read, and I've referenced in your textbook, before he leaves, he says, we know exactly what's going to happen there. They're going to present us with demands that we can't possibly meet because they would require us to violate all of our basic principles back here at home, and we're not going to do that. But on the other hand, there are serious differences among them. Now, he knows that there are serious differences among them because the Germans have already said, if we can't do it any other way, we're willing to go it alone with you guys, and we will recognize your government, and we will enter into a most favored nation trade agreement with you. So, Rakovsky has this secret agreement in his hip pocket, and just to be sure that everything's cool in Berlin, he and Chicherin and the entire delegation go by train first to Berlin, then to Genoa. When they get to Genoa, now this is April 1922, the first thing they do is start having press conferences at the university where they get a pretty good reception. You know what college students are like. And they continue with their negotiations with the British and the French, but they're getting nowhere. So Lenin watches all this from afar, and of course he's in constant telephonic and telegraphic communication with them. And Rakovsky's just waiting for Lenin to pull the trigger, which he finally does, and when he does, the Germans and the Soviet delegation go to a suburb of Genoa called Rapallo. At that time, Rapallo was probably more of a little town. Right now, it's just, well, last time I was there in 1960, 61, it was already a suburb of Genoa, so I'm sure that it's nothing more than that today. But at any rate, in 1922, it's a little seaside village right next to Genoa on the Italian Riviera. They go there and they hammer out what's called the Rapallo Treaty, which becomes the basis of Soviet foreign policy from that moment on up until the beginning of World War II. You'll see as these lectures progress why it was so important. But at any rate, when they come out of Rapallo, Verkovsky gets the name as the magician of Rapallo. He has arranged all of this. The Soviet government is now recognized by Germany. For the first time, a major capitalist government recognizes the Soviet government. It has a most favored nation trade agreement. It has a secret protocol which allows the German army to train its officers on Soviet soil. There are many different advantages to it, but it has broken the Western capitalist anti-Soviet alliance, in effect, because what it has done is to make Germany, one of the major capitalist powers of the West, into a ally of the Soviet government. Lenin sends Christian Verkovsky to London. Now he tells when he gets there, he makes the arrangements for a jailbreak for Michael Borodin, who's in prison up there, for organizing British communists. That's another story that we go into in your textbook. And then he comes directly back to Moscow once he escapes from that joint. And there Lenin gives him his new orders. Well, what are those new orders? These new orders are for him to go to China and get the alliance with Sun Yat-sen up and running. There, as I say, there's a whole chapter, chapter 14, called Bolshevism Spreads to China in your textbook, where you can go ahead and read this. We're going to go back to the Soviet Union proper now in 1924 to 26. Lenin dies in January 1924. Leadership mantle passes to the three, Kamenev, Zinoviev, and Stalin. And in fact, in practice, it goes to Stalin. Why is that? Well, both Zamenhof and Kamenev are legendarily lazy, especially Zinoviev, who spent time in Switzerland while he was with the Leninists there in Geneva, trying to figure out how to invent a washing machine for dishes, because he didn't like to wash dishes. So, at any rate, he's more than happy to sit around and talk whatever they have Politburo meetings and let Stalin do all the work, which is perfect because Stalin works every day of the year and every hour of the day except for the 5 hours he sleeps from 5 to 10 in the morning, 5 a.m. to 10 a.m. So the leadership is actually transferred into the hands of the General Secretary on just about everything, because by now the General Secretary is running just about everything. So when 1926 arrives, what we have is a situation where the Army is in a serious state of dilapidation. That is, it has neither the things it needs right now to be fully up to speed, and it certainly doesn't have the prospects of having a modernized basis in the future. So something has to be done about that. Well, from 1923 until 1926, Verkovsky was then sent to London to be the Soviet's ambassador to London, and while he was there, he wrote on his way out the door, actually, an article that was published in the journal Communist International called "The Decline of the World's Shop," which was about the situation in 1926 in what was then contemporary British capitalism. And what he saw on the way out the door there was that there was a serious economic crisis in Great Britain that was both structural and irreversible. I'm not going to get into that in this lecture, but you can read about it in the textbook if you're interested. He found that this crisis was true across the board in the manufacturing industries of Great Britain, and that the biggest problem for the ruling class there was that they had no obvious way out, and that in the meantime, while they were trying to figure out what to do about it, that they would step up their anti-communist propaganda, break relations with the Soviet Union, and do everything they possibly could to subvert the Soviet government in Russia. Now, he was exactly right about all of that, and what happened was that the British ruling class settled on a many-year-long policy of isolating the Soviet Union and trying to prepare some way to overthrow the Soviet government. And this was led by two men, the most important of which was Stanley Baldwin. His understudy was Neville Chamberlain. These were the Tory party leaders, that is, Conservative party leaders in England. 3 times during this period from 1923 to 1938, Baldwin is going to be Prime Minister. But throughout the entire period, what's really happening here is that one way or another, they would like Germany to take the point in attacking the Soviet Union. Well, of course, the Rapallo Treaty had put a real block into that whole idea, because that would mean converting Germany from being a Soviet ally into being the spearhead of Soviet opposition. What further threw this whole thing into conflict was when Hitler took over as the leader of Germany in 1934. The Baldwin Plan was set back for a while because the British ruling class didn't want an upstart non-entity like Hitler running the show for them. So their initial attitude in Germany was to replace Hitler with somebody that was more amenable to them. And they didn't get over that idea until the Spanish Civil War started going badly for the fascists in Spain, and they finally decided to accept Hitler as the leader of the anti-Bolshevik coalition that they were putting together. At any rate, that's what was going on behind the scenes there. What was happening in Russia, we had our own crises, but they were unaware of it. Well, they were unaware of it for several reasons. One of them was that their intelligence networks inside Russia had been completely destroyed. Now, one of the ways in which they were destroyed was the creation of the MOCR, and that was an umbrella organization that the Bolsheviks created, that the Russian emigre white anti-Bolshevik leaders were being attracted into. It's called the Monarchist Organization for Central Russia. So everybody from the Tsar's uncle on down thought that they were contributing money to and being part of a real conspiracy that would overthrow the Soviet government, but was actually just a Cheka front organization. So they had a pretty good idea of what was going on then. We had our own crisis, which, as I say, this monarchist organization for Central Russia had rounded up all of these enemies and pretty well gotten rid of them. That's a story which we go into in more detail in the book. But the important point here is that this is one of the reasons the Western countries just assumed that the Soviet economy was developing in fits and starts, kind of like their own was, but that wasn't really the case. And we had another problem that they were unaware of, and that was that we were getting the same kind of problem in the economy that we had had in the Army. What was that? Well, in the Army, we had a early on conflict which continued throughout the time that the Army was being built between the old Tsarist officers who were being brought under control in the ways that we have discussed with political officers, and especially Chekists as political officers, and the new Red Army officers who came from working class backgrounds and were ideologically Bolshevik, and as time went on were becoming better and better combat officers. So they wanted to have the spots in the Army that these old Tsarist officers were getting, and they thought they deserved them for obvious class reasons. So there had been an early division among the officer class within the Red Army. Remember, this is an army that got to be 5.5 million men strong, so it had a lot of officers and a lot of NCOs, and those new guys coming up, they wanted these jobs for themselves. Well, in the Army, things had kind of sorted themselves out with time because the old Tsarist officers had just gotten old, and they were being weeded out as rapidly as possible. Now, but we had the same thing going on in industry. We had the old bourgeois specialists who had grudgingly come over to Bolshevik control because that's the only place. If they were going to be in Russia, there was no place to work except for the government. And you had the new new specialists, technical specialists, that were being trained in the Bolshevik colleges in all of the major cities in a variety of technical areas. Guys like Khrushchev, for example, who came off the farm, came out of the army, got an opportunity to go to school, got a job, became a specialist, an engineer of sorts, and then naturally he wanted a job when he gets out of there. Well, there was competition between these old bourgeois specialists for the limited number of jobs that were available, and with this new burgeoning class of Bolshevik managers. So this was something that, of course, the capitalists were unaware of, because they had no intelligence apparatus, they had no contact with, well, they had very little contact with what was going on inside Russia. So that was one of the things that they didn't understand that was happening on our side of the fence. Now, those were conflicts that were real important, but still, at the bottom of everything, when you got down with your budget authorization year, the biggest problem was that you didn't have the money to do any of the things that the Army needed to do and do any of these programs well. Now, there is a book called Hammer and Rifle. It's written, published in the year 2000. Author is David Stone, University of Kansas Press. It was his doctoral dissertation, but as a book, you can get it in many libraries. It's important because it takes you through the details of the attempt to finance the Red Army during the 1920s. And nothing can be more important to our understanding of what was going on then than understanding the budgetary problems that were confronted by the Bolshevik government. Now, in 1923-24, the government got almost no money from agriculture because there had been a collapse of world prices. And so where did it get its money? Well, it had oil, and it had timber and diamonds, a variety of mineral resources, furs, exotic products like caviar, things that it sold on international market, and it made money, but it didn't get anything from wheat at all. So that was a real blow. So they started out about as low as you could get in terms of how much money do you have on available. In the following budgetary year, 24-25, things got a little better. They had a slight budgetary surplus. They were able to give more money to the Army. Now, during this period of time, the Finance Commissariat went through 5 different directors before they ended up with a fellow named Gregory Sokolnikov. Sokolnikov himself has an interesting background, which I go over in your text, but for our purposes, suffice it to say that Sokolnikov finally gets the job as chairman of the Financial Commissariat, Finance Commissar, and like we'd call treasurer, and it's his job to oversee the amount of money that the government has and will pay out. One thing about Sokolnikov is that he's well known for being a person who will not engage in deficit financing. In other words, whatever we have is what we're going to split up, but we're not going to print any more money than what we can back up with gold, so or some gold equivalent. And that is a real budgetary constraint. Now, in these days, where the capitalists have invented a system of just printing money for themselves whenever they feel like it, people have forgotten what budgetary restraints amount to, but it wasn't that long ago that all of the world had budgetary restraints. You didn't spend more than you had coming in without having massive devaluation of your currency. Well, this, of course, the Soviets were not going to allow. If they were, Sokolnikov well knew, if they're going to trade on the international market using the rubles, and they're going to have their rubles backed up with gold. So they really don't have any choice as far as he's concerned, and the party agrees, no deficit financing. So in the years from 1924 to 1928, there isn't any deficit financing, with one exception. In the end of 1926, Sokolnikov was replaced by another man who is in every way exactly like himself, but he's willing to allow a 5 million ruble increase in the budget by borrowing it from next year's budget. That's deficit financing, but it's something which Stalin says, all right, in this one particular situation, because of the urgency and so on and so forth, we will agree to that 5 million ruble out of a billion ruble budget. You see, that's a very small percentage, but even that was something that they had to fight over. Sokolnikov got replaced by a man who was almost identical to him over such a small amount. But at any rate, this is the situation that confronted the government. And in your textbook, on pages 248 through 258, I think they are, you will see that every year there's a tremendous budgetary fight over how much money can be allocated to the Army and under what circumstances. But in every case, the finance commissar is always saying, well, you know, you guys are talking a lot of pie in the sky here because you want 1.1 billion rubles for the Army, but you're going to get 600 million, period. That's it. I don't care how many more special allotments or whatever pleas you've got. That's what you're going to get, and you're going to have to divide it up among yourselves. The crisis is coming in 1928. There are 3 Central Committee meetings, full meetings that year, to discuss various things that Stalin calls. One of them, of course, is the failure of the China policy. We've skipped all of that, but by 1928, the China adventure is over, and it has failed. What that means, among other things, is that the buffer out there in the Far East that Lenin had hoped to build against imperialist attack has not been built. So that means the Soviet Union is vulnerable again on both fronts, West and East. So the international situation is not good. The domestic situation is not good because we still have a situation where agriculture is extremely primitive. And what he wants the party to do, and what they will agree to do, is modernize agriculture and collectivize it. The big thing that is going to happen is that in the end of July, that is with the beginning of the new fiscal year, and the end of the harvest, which is the most important thing, at the end of August, they're going to collectivize agriculture. What does that mean? It means collective farms and cooperative farms. And the general idea is that these things have been started experimentally, and we will just step up the experimental process. The idea being that farmers will be encouraged to go into these collectives and cooperatives, and the state will support that by, and that's the way they're going to encourage it, by setting them tractors and various kinds of machinery, fertilizer, credits, various kinds of advantages that regular farmers won't have, and so they will look to them and see that this is a preferable way of going. And as the years pass, collectivization will naturally take its course. What happens in practice is quite different. Stalin, I think, knows all the time that to get this done right for the Army, for the entire Bolshevik experiment, they're going to have to collectivize agriculture overnight. Overnight meaning overnight. In other words, when the harvest is in at the end of August, we're going to start removing the kulaks from the countryside. We're going to reorganize the massive farmers into collective farms and cooperative farms, and this is going to happen in a matter of weeks and months. All right, well, who are these kulaks? Well, originally, kulak was the term that the Tsar gave to the rich farmers that he used to control the mass of the peasants in a given district. But they had been liquidated as a class in 1917, 1918 with the Bolshevik Revolution. So those original kulaks were long gone, and their property had been split up along with the rest of the Tsar's property and the rest of his church's property among the peasantry. And that was a grab bag affair. Whatever you could grab for yourself is what you got. There was very little government control over this, because the Bolsheviks really didn't have the ability to control the countryside anyway. So the land redistribution had been a free-for-all grab bag affair, and whoever got what is what they ended up with, as long as they weren't an aristocrat, a priest, or a kulak. From 1918 to 1928, what has happened? Well, in that 10-year period, the countryside, you'll recall it, the new economic policy legalized capitalism in the countryside again in 1921. So in that period of time, we'd gone from a command economy where what the Army wanted it just went out and took, That's what was called war communism. And if you were lucky, they'd leave you an IOU, and then if you were even luckier, you might get some money for it after the Civil War is over. Went from that command economy of war communism to a situation where farmers were producing on whatever land they had grabbed for themselves and taking it to the local marketplace. In other words, capitalism had been restored in the countryside. That was called New Economic Policy. During that period of time, one group of people ended up with a lot more than the others, and this new group of people, the wealthiest farmers, were called kulaks again by the party. Those that were in the middle, who had a decent amount of land, and were called middle farmers. Those who had gotten the least amount of land were called the poor farmers, and there was still a fourth class of farmers who had gotten nothing at all, who were agricultural laborers. So the party had decided that to make collectivization work, it would whip up these landless workers and the poorest farmers and have them take the land of the kulaks, and they'd deport the kulaks. Well, and so this happened like in a matter of days and weeks. Well, how did they manage to pull that off? Well, it brought from the cities a huge number of youth that had been indoctrinated into the importance of carrying out this second revolution in Russia in the countryside, breaking the back of capitalism, help the poor peasants seize the land of the rich peasants. And that's what happened. And then alongside that, there were the Chicas that came in tens of thousands, who were now armed troops with the order of backing up the poorest farmers and the landless agricultural laborers in their demands against the kulaks. And in Moscow, Molotov said the middle peasants will snap to attention when they see what's going on out there, meaning that they will see it's in their interest to join these collectives too. If they don't, they could be on the next train going to Siberia, which is what was happening. The kulaks and their families in these areas were rounded up, put on trains, and sent to Siberia for periods of 5 years to start over as virgin farmers on virgin land. Dumped out there someplace, and I don't know the details of how they got started, but somehow they did get started. And for most of them, they didn't come back. For most of their kids, they did come back, but so that the Bolsheviks had only set off this problem of the rich farmers for 5 years, but they had got them out of the picture. Furthermore, the former rich farmers were not allowed to ever participate in collective farm, which meant participate in agriculture, back home ever again. So they were banned from life, from that kind of activity. So what would they have to go back to if they did go back? So most of them stayed out there in places in Siberia or Soviet Central Asia that most people in this country would never have heard of at that time, especially. So that's where they went. The collectivization was successful because it got Stalin what he wanted, and that was within a year they had 100% of the arable land of Russia under their ownership. So that what you did was you paid workers to go out there and harvest this land, sow it, do everything else that you have to do on a farm, and as agricultural workers, and they had little plots by their house so they could grow something on for their family if they wanted to, in terms of vegetables or whatever people do grow in little gardens, and that was it. So that the government owned everything that had been in private hands before. There's never a time in Soviet history after this where the government doesn't have plenty of money. Well, why is that? It's because now it has 100% of the arable land of the entire country in terms of its agricultural produce, as well as the timber, the oil, the exotic products like caviar, diamonds, so on, that it could sell on the international marketplace. So after 1928, the budgetary problems of the Red Army have been solved for the first time. When you go through Mr. Stone's book, Hammer and Rifle, you will see how the Soviet government had no choice. If it was going to modernize, and what that means is if it was going to be able to retain state power, if it's going to keep itself alive, it has to be able to resist the impending imperialist attack, which is going to come sooner or later. It's only a matter of time. In fact, the weaker you are, the sooner it's almost undoubtedly going to happen. So this is what they were confronted with. Well, now this collectivization solves all of that problem. Now, it created all kinds of problems. When I grew up, they used to say in schools that, well, Russian agriculture never recovered from this Stalinist period, and so on and so forth, which was utter nonsense. It depends. If you want to say that private ownership never recovered from the Stalinist period, well, that's quite true. But as far as the government's concerned, it was never better off than after collectivization, and that made all of the difference. From that time forward, Stalin was able to mobilize the Red Army and do what it had to do. And it solved the problem of this division of the specialists into old bourgeois specialists and new guys that had just come out of the colleges, because all of a sudden you had all of this industrialization going on, so all the jobs in the world, that you had a labor shortage, not a labor surplus. So in this way, the problem of bourgeois specialists versus new graduates was resolved, and so that entered the agenda of problems that had been solved by history one way or another, the first being the problem within the army. And in 1925, in January, Trotsky was removed as war commissar. Now, he was replaced by Frunze as war commissar. In 1926, in October, Trotsky's kicked out of the political bureau. Later in that same, in October 1927, he is removed from the Central Committee. Why is that? Well, the excuse for getting him out of the political bureau was he refused to take jobs that they were giving him. He said they were beneath him, and he was mad about being replaced as war commissar by Frunze. So they said, all right, well, we're not in the mood to put up with your bullshit any longer, so you're out. So he was replaced. And then he was removed from the Central Committee altogether in October 1927. But he still wouldn't shut up, and he started organizing opposition to them of one kind or another, and trying to do it within the party, and organizing some demonstrations. So in January of 1928, he was expelled from the Communist Party altogether, and he was sent to Turkestan, Soviet Turkestan. That didn't work. He didn't shut up out there. So in February of 1929, they sent him out of the Soviet Union altogether. This time they sent him to an island off of Istanbul, where he spent the next 5 years. His Chika escort handed him $1,500 US in severance pay, and he was on his own. All right, now, it occurs to me from time to time that Stalin could have gotten rid of this guy anytime he wanted to. I think he found it useful to keep Trotsky around in exile because he needed a whipping boy, somebody to go after, and Trotsky made himself available for that job. His big disagreement with Stalin was not on whether to industrialize or not, but on the pace of industrialization. Well, pace, as far as Stalin was concerned, was what the entire matter of collectivization was about. So, in a sense, he set him up as the perfect straw man, and he let him sit on that island for 5 years. Now, Trotsky eventually, he traveled across Europe. Various members of his family were arrested, some were shot, various things happened to him here and there. He went to Mexico as the guest of Diego Rivera and President Cardenas, and while he was there, he was relatively safe because he was guarded by the president's police, and that's no joke in Mexico. And he was living in the house of Diego Rivera and his wife, Frida Kahlo. Well, Trotsky disgraced himself there by having a sexual affair with Rivera's wife that he found out about. So when that happened, he and Frida Kahlo did whatever they were doing together. That would not have been unusual among the Mexicans of that group, but it wasn't a real smart move for Trotsky, especially since his wife was with him. And because when Rivera got mad about it, Trotsky had to leave, and he went to a home which was nearby, that was owned by Miss Calho, and he went there to live. But when the president, Cardenas, found out what the real reason was for the Rivera-Trotsky split, he said, "Oh, I've had enough of this," and he pulled his bodyguards and he said, "You guys are on your own." That wasn't good either, because that meant that what he had left to guard him wasn't nearly as good as having the president's bodyguard out there. So what he actually had were some reasonably good bodyguards from Minneapolis, which is the only place that Trotsky had a Union base that I'm aware of in the United States. They had them in the Minneapolis Teamsters. So they pulled those guys down from Minneapolis to guard him, but obviously they didn't do a very good job. The one attempt was made on his life there, I believe it was in May, by Karros, who had come back from Spain and was a famous, not only famous Mexican painter, but a famous general from or officer from the Spanish Civil War. So that failed. Beria kind of suspected that it would fail because he didn't have much respect for this bunch of Mexicans based upon the way they had performed in Spain. So he had another man standing by. And that man standing by was deeply infiltrated into Trotsky's circles in a way that gave him access to the house. And a few months after Sakharov's attempt to kill Trotsky, this guy succeeded, and he buried an ice pick in Trotsky's head. Well, the two of them were alone in Trotsky's study, and Trotsky died the next day. The assassin went to prison for 20 years. When he got out of prison, he went to Havana and then to Moscow, and in Moscow he was awarded the Order of Lenin, Hero of the Soviet Union, which he had already received from Stalin in absentia, as had his mother. Both he and his mother were famous Chicas from Spain, and this guy had infiltrated himself into the Trotsky organization under the orders of the Chicas during the 1930s, and the whole story is in the book if you're interested. But the reason I went through this right here is because Trotsky, as you can see in this period of time, is not a political factor in this Communist Party of the Soviet Union at all. He's from the day Lenin dies, he's on his way out. And 1925, 1926, 1927, 1928 are the various steps which are outlined there, which shows pretty much what happened to him. Okay. Now, what about the Red Army itself? Well, in 1924, we had an army that had been reduced to about 600,000. That still would be, on Western standards, a pretty darn big army, but that means that around 5 million men have already been discharged and sent back into the economy. They were actually needed in the economy, so in that sense, that wasn't harmful, because they were the backbone of the youth that were now being sent back into industry. But the readiness of the Red Army had been reduced, obviously, from down to now about 600,000 men. The fiscal year of the Soviet government now runs from October 1st to the end of September every year. Something to keep in mind, because when we're talking about the government's budget for the 1923-24 fiscal year, we're talking about the beginning of October 1923 to the end of September 1924. And that budget that year was 329.2 million rubles. And of this, the Red Army got 2/3, and the Red Navy 30 million rubles, and the war industry only 90 million rubles. Well, you can tell by the relative differences there that you're not going to be getting, there's not very much going in. This is just barely enough to keep everybody fed, clothed, and housed. And certainly not much. You're not going to be building much military equipment with a 90 million ruble budget for the entire year. 1925 is the beginning of a real reorganization of the Red Army. Well, of course, one way it starts is because at the end of January 1925, Trotsky is removed as War Commissar and replaced with Michael Frunze, who has been the chief of staff for a long time and the de facto boss anyway. But now, at this time, he has just written the introduction to the basic textbook of the Soviet Army, which is called The Foundations of the Mobilization of Industry for the Needs of War. Now, that was written by a man named Karros, and Frunze wrote the introduction to that textbook. Now, what is the important thing about that particular textbook? Well, the introduction, by the way, that Frunze wrote is called Front and Rear in Future War. And the textbook, in short, we'll call General Foundations. The most important part of that is that Karros has said that what we have in the Red Army is an entirely new kind of army, one that it represents the interests of the people and is not created to suppress the people. And therefore, we can have an entirely different relationship between mobilization of industry and the Red Army. And he goes on to put forward 4 proposals. There'll be a core of permanent military industries established. Secondly, that the rest of the industrial infrastructure has to be built in such a way that it can be immediately converted to military production when war came. And thirdly, to recognize always that war is inevitable. It's only a matter of time and who will move first. And fourth, the entire civilian population has to be prepared to be militarized when that war comes. Now, this General Foundation textbook is the basic book by which the Red Army is built over the next couple of decades. Now, the first document, it's also the first document you may want to read when you get ready to understand the Napoleonic battle plan for 1941. What I think many of you will realize for the first time reading this book is that far from being unprepared, the Stalin government was more than prepared for everything that Germany did in World War II. I mean, they had foreseen it down to the great intimate details, and there were 2 options: either they strike first, or they get struck first. And in the event of getting struck first by the Germans and their allies, then they would have the Napoleonic battle plan to fall back on. Which, in other words, the war would develop pretty much the way it did. Sokolnikov was the guy that they brought in to control the budget and what we would call the treasurer, because he had a record of success in financial affairs. He had originally been the man that had gotten the necessary gold marks that from the German government that the Bolshevik government had to have in order to stabilize its ruble. And then, when Trotsky failed to get the agreement that Lenin wanted at Brest-Litovsk, it was Sokolnikov he sent to get that agreement finally. You remember we mentioned last time that Trotsky had not gotten the agreement that Lenin wanted. I suggested the real reason was that he knew that since the Politburo was divided between those who were for Lenin and those who were against the idea of peace at any price, that no matter what position he took, it was going to alienate half the Politburo, which would mean his chances of ever succeeding Lenin were very, very small. On the other hand, if he took a position of no war, no peace, then he wouldn't be alienating either wing, so he thought. However, the Germans wouldn't buy that, and they kicked him out, and they went on and started cleaning up, doing what they had threatened to do anyway, which was to march on Petrograd. So at that point, Lenin replaced Trotsky with Sokolnikov and sent Sokolnikov to negotiate with the Germans, with whom Sokolnikov was already working to stabilize the Russian ruble. All right, so he had a lot of experience, is my point, in financial matters and the associated political matters. So he knew exactly what was going on there. And in 1924-25, as I say, the Russian army had gotten almost nothing from agriculture because the Soviet government had gotten nothing from agriculture. Now in 1925-26, this began to change, and there was a great deal of 2 million tons of grain were exported in the early part of 1926. So the military budget was allowed to increase up to 600 million rubles. But at the same time, in January 1926, the Central Committee decided to replace the chief Commissar, which was Sokolnikov, with another fellow who, as I say, was almost exactly the same way, except that he would allow a 5 million ruble deficit spending based on spending what was in next year's budget right now. And those were the kinds of problems they were confronted. Well, the details of what they confronted were that, try as they might, they had not been able to break up the English-French alliance, which was formalized in Locarno back in October 1925. And this was an actual anti-Bolshevik grand alliance. Their objective was to find out some way to militarily attack the Soviet Union. Why? Well, they were faced with a great deal of difficulties of their own country from their own workers who wanted them to do things that the Bolshevik government was doing for its workers, and they weren't able to do that. So their idea was to start a war with the Soviet Union. And similar to the situation today is the U.S. capitalist ruling oligarchs are unable to solve the problems they have at home, so they're going to try and start a war with Russia over the Ukraine. It's a last-ditch step, but it also falls in line with their general idea, the Wolfowitz-Kagan doctrine of dominating the world by destroying or isolating Iran, China, and Russia. A hopeless design, but one that they have bought into for so long they don't seem to be able to get out of. At any rate, only what happens on the ground now will determine whether they have any future with this or not. But in 1926, it seemed as if they, at Locarno, that something was going to have to be done to counter the plots of the British and the French. Well, General Tukhachevsky back in Moscow is telling the Political Bureau that we have got to mobilize for war right now, and we should strike the first blow. This preventive war thesis of his is based on the idea that the frontline countries against us, backed up by Britain and France, can mobilize more men with more equipment than we can right now because we're just not up to par. We don't have a big enough army, and it's not properly equipped. So Rykov, who's the chairman who replaced Lenin as head of government, forms a commission to look into this situation, see if things are really as urgent as Tukhachevsky says they are. And the Rykov Commission comes back with a recommendation that says, yeah, things are bad. We're not prepared to resist an attack from England and France and the frontline countries in a protracted war. So the Rykov Commission recommends that another 700 million rubles be sent to the army for emergency purposes. Well, the finance commissariat says, no, this is not going to happen. This is how much you guys are going to get, period, and then you just decide how to divide it up among yourselves. So as 1927 and 1928 approach, the party, which is the ultimate source of all authority, has got to decide what the hell it's going to do. And what they're going to do, as it turns out, is they're going to get more money, because there's no way of splitting up this pie to satisfy all of the demands that are being placed upon the government. And there are 3 Central Committee meetings during the course of 1928, which deal with everything from the failure of the China policy to the current policies of the Western countries against them, and what needs to be done internally. And the party agrees that they will collectivize agriculture. I think their original thought was that this was going to be a slower process than it turned out to be. What it turned out to be was that at the beginning of September, the party cadre moved into all of these agricultural villages and areas and insisted that the poor farmers and the agricultural workers that were handle land get together and seize the land of the rich farmers. And to be sure that this was legal and backed up, tens of thousands of Chicas troops were sent to the countryside to enforce it. So overnight, the rich farmers were simply disenfranchised. Their property was seized in totality. They were placed on train cars and they were shipped out to Soviet Central Asia and Siberia to start over again, and exiled for periods of 5 years. And this exile, furthermore, meant that they would never be allowed back on farms in the countries from which they came.